Night lost its hold reluctantly over the city, as if the bay itself was unwilling to surrender the cool black hush it had stretched like a bomb across burned stones and charred palisades. Dawn laid its first pale fingers on the crenellations of the Red Keep, and the iron warder bells, pitted by salt and years, muttered to themselves as gulls answered in raucous white swoops. On the terrace above Maegor's Holdfast, where a king might stand and be mistaken for a carving against the sky, Joffrey Baratheon found the air faint with smoke that was not quite gone, stale pitch river reek, and the faint sweetness that lingered after wildfire had spent itself and left memory in mortar. The city would remember that brightness for centuries, he had been told. He liked that thought. Let them remember brightness and fear. But the door did not scrape in warning when his grandfather came. Tywin Lannister entered like a change of weather, only the softest rasp of cloth and the measured click of a spur across stone to announce him. The hand did not bow. He did not ask permission to share the view either. He merely set a gloved hand on the Merlon edge, as if this wall had been constructed for his use. The light caught on the filigree of the chain at his throat, the hand of office, washing it in morning water. "The city sleeps," Joffrey said, the first words he spoke that morning, and studied how they sounded when he made them gentle. "The city labors," Tywin replied. "It labors when you do not see it." Joffrey let the gull cry soaring the air fill the space that followed. He could feel his own jaw straining to shape something sharp. He thought of the way heads looked when they were taken down from spikes, plucked birds, mostly, with damp hair and the crown of the skull bright like wet marble under its scabbed skin. His mouth almost said something about the spikes, but he did not. He lifted his chin a little. "You sent for me," he said instead, though both knew it had been worded as an invitation he might decline. "You will attend the small council," Tywin said. "Every day. I have a king's business." "Then bring it," Tywin said, as if it could be gathered into a pouch, "to the table where the business of kings is conducted. Bring it where you can learn how a signature becomes bread for a city and ships for a fleet." It was a reprimand. It was also an offer. Joffrey studied the old man's profile. A hawk had lines like that. It would not do to look abashed. It would not do to look anything but bored, perhaps faintly amused. He had learned what faces pleased men. They wanted to see a boy among their elders, or else a boy's vanity for them to temper, to scold, to save. The trick, he had discovered, was to appear to need it. He could feel Margaery Tyrell's green eyes watching even when she was not in the room, the soft encouragement in her voice made to sound like admiration rather than guidance. Everyone wanted to teach him. He let them think they could. "As you advise," he said, careful with the words. "Grandfather." Tywin's gaze flicked to him at that, brief as a blade. Joffrey expected the cool, dry nod. Instead, his grandfather let the silence stand as if weighing a coin. Then he moved his hand, a light tap of leather against stone. "Attend. Listen. Speak when you should. Remember that a king who does not summon counsel invites it in other forms." He did not look at the boy then. He let the gulls make the morning noisy. Joffrey kept his stillness. He imagined the council table, the red wood polished with oil and elbow grease, rings scored where goblets had bitten, a map's edges curling like the corners of a mouth too long held shut. He imagined his mother gliding in late, the way she always did now, letting the whole room turn to look. He imagined Tyrion. Scarred, smaller than his voice, eyes bright as knife points, turning some jest to carve at the soft places. He imagined the Tyrells with their sweet-smelling confidence, draped in summer cloth, and the suggestion of orchards. He imagined. He commanded himself not to imagine. Crossbows. He made his lips loosen from the thought. Tywin turned then, as if satisfied. He never put a hand to Joffrey's shoulder, never risked a familiarity that might make them smaller in the eyes of servants or stone. He expected obedience the way the sun expected the sea to throw up light. When he was gone, Joffrey let the morning air fill his chest until it hurt, then exhaled. A gull landed on the parapet and set one white foot forward like a courtier. He moved his fingers toward the bird. It cocked its head, yellow eye very bright, then launched away with disdain. The council chamber was already full when he arrived, as if he were the one expected to take a seat and be grateful for it. Joffrey made himself walk neither fast nor slow. The doors had been opened to let the day in. City noise leaked up through the stones. Wagon wheels, raucous hawkers, the chop of oars against the green-tarnished water. Varys smiled that unpinned smile and bowed. Pycelle labored up from his chair, all in clicks and wheezes and whiskers. Tyrion's gaze flicked up and down his nephew with a whitish curiosity, as if Joffrey were a page he meant to dog-ear. Littlefinger sat with fingers steepled and bored expression, a posture he wore like perfume. "Your Grace," Tywin said, making the formality sound like the spine of the room, and indicated the chair at the table's head without apology. Joffrey sat. He let the silence settle for a heartbeat too long, listening to how his presence rearranged breath. Then he rested his palm near, not on, the knife at his place. The knife was ordinary, with scratches where it had been sharpened so much it would not have been worth stealing. He liked that. "Provisions," Tywin said without preface. "Lady Margaery has arranged for shipments to arrive at the Mud Gate. We will not have bread riots. We will not have coin wasted in falsified manifests." Littlefinger looked injured that embezzlement had been uninvited from the room so bluntly. "We might find, Lord Hand, that honest record-keeping brings in less money than a certain elasticity." "We will find that we keep the city," Tywin said. Margaery was not in the room, of course, but she might as well have been, for the effect of her name. Joffrey felt the muscles in his neck loosen. He imagined her hands distributing bread with a priestly grace, each loaf a blessed thing brought into being by her smile. She did that. She made the ugly acts of governance smell like rosewater. She would, he thought, make motherhood smell agreeable when it came. "How many loaves?" Joffrey said, before Tyrion could pounce on the opening or Varys could coo. The question surprised him as much as them, for it was not the type he had ever allowed himself to ask. He made his face blank. "How many each day?" Pycelle goggled, as if the boy had asked him to dance. Littlefinger's eyes ticked sideways. Varys' head tilted an elegant degree. Tywin did not smile. He never did, but something like approval moved the air around him. 40,000 daily, Your Grace," the hand said. "If the Tyrell barges are not delayed by wind or bribery." "And if they are?" Joffrey asked. "Then," Tywin said, "we ration, and we find who is stealing and take his hand." It was a small violence, like the solving of an equation. Joffrey let its neatness sit on his tongue. He did not ask to make a spectacle of the thief when he was discovered. He imagined the hand on a hook and heard, as if from far away, the applause of 100 men he would never meet. He did not ask for it. Tyrion made a show of scratching his chewed quill. "Your Grace inquires like a steward," he said, smile crisp. "I am nearly moved." "I have been told to attend," Joffrey said, arranging a tone that was gratitude dipped in a little steel. He saw Varys' lids lower, approving, calculating, hard to say. "If I am to attend, I will hear sums." Littlefinger looked faintly disappointed, as if a card he meant to play had slid under the table. It pleased Joffrey to see it. There were letters to consider, always letters, folded, rolled, sealed with wax that blushed under candlelight. The wax-pooled looked like tongues in a row. Tywin brought them forth with the calm of a man drawing water. There was talk of a great wedding, of course, and of the expense and the spectacle, and the necessity of making the city see its future in gold and silk. The Tyrell women understood pageant the way a butler understands wine. Lady Olenna's name moved through the conversation like a dry knife. When it appeared, Littlefinger's chin lifted the way a cat's might at a canary's wing beat. Joffrey said nothing at her mention. He held his face as if bored by grandmothers. But he remembered the clarity of the old woman's eyes and the way she had appraised him like a horse. He wanted her gone. He did not say so. Other letters spoke of quieter matters. The Riverlands groaned under armies like an old man's back under a hod. Frey riders had been seen on the west bank, and then unseen with a speed that boded ill for whoever attracted their notice. Houses that had named King Robb slipped their banners down half-mast, as if fearing to be seen in full wind. Ravens from Roose Bolton came with bloodless courtesy, brilliant in their clarity. Tywin read those twice. He let the others talk while his mouth thinned, and he ran a thumb along the bottom edge of a seal, as if he could feel through wax into the throat of its sender. "We will need to announce something," Varys murmured. "After the wedding, perhaps. Peace with dignity. Mercy with memory. Nenderwarden." "Mercy," Tywin said, tasting the word as if it had bone in it. "We will announce the king's intent for peace." "Might the king speak today?" Tyrion asked, glancing toward his nephew's composed mouth. "We find the small folk do enjoy a royal voice. It makes them think of stories. Stories make them docile." Joffrey could feel his mother's displeasure burn from 2 chairs away. Cersei had come, indeed, late with a flush of wine at her cheekbones and something brittle around her mouth that had not quite been there before. She watched him as if she were hunting some sign the child she had raised remained inside this young man. She had labored to make him a sword. He had become something else in Tywin's hand. He could almost pity her for a heartbeat. Then her expression tilted and the pity dried. "I will speak when my hand advises," Joffrey said, and made himself glance at Tywin as if awaiting a cue. The gesture tasted like raw linen, but he swallowed. Tywin looked at him for a count of 2, aware that every eye watched. "This afternoon," he said. 8 Baelor's steps, not to promise what you cannot deliver, not to boast. You will bless the city with food that already exists. You will make vows only a reasonable man can keep." "I am reasonable," Joffrey said lightly, and found the effort of lightness was less than he had expected. The steps of the great sept still held the smell of old rain. The marble had been scrubbed. Blood clung to stone long after the priests gave it back to holy purposes. But the smell of it had gone. Joffrey took those steps as a man takes a horse with a good mouth, gentle but not coaxing. Margaery stood at his right hand like May itself dressed as a woman, her smile precise enough to cut fruit. The crowd below spread like a pelt, rough and many-colored, patched by rooftop and alley shadow, pierced here and there by sunlight that made heads gleam like polishing apples. A child cried. A woman laughed too loudly at something said a long way away. The press was still hungry, the rot still at the edges, but the air did not taste of riot. Words had been prepared for him. Their cadence was Tywin's, or perhaps the High Septon's, or perhaps Varys. The script wore so many hands it was as neutral as water. Joffrey let it in his mouth and made it his own by omitting 2 phrases that sounded too gentle. He spoke of bread and the ships that brought it. He spoke of the war lifting in the west, in terms of clouds thinning. He did not speak of victory. He spoke instead of repair. When he was finished, there was a silence that was not quite disappointment and not quite obedience. Then the sound came. Rough. Honest. Applause from hands that had thrown stones not a year past. Margaery took his hand on the last phrase, a theatrical gesture calculated to be visible from the docks. He felt the press of her fingers, with a curious gratitude that was not wholly appetite. Beside her, her grandmother's face was dry as a parchment, the mouth flat. He could not tell what calculation the old woman adjusted in her head. She watched him as if looking through a small window. He told his face to relax. He told his fingers to release the impulse to crush Margaery's hand until those rings bit into her skin. It would amuse him. It would ruin something larger. From the steps he could see his uncle Tyrion below, half in shadow, eyes turned upward with a scrutiny that did not bother to pretend at reverence. Sansa Stark stood beside her husband. Stark. The name fell through him, like a dark bead in water. She had the pale gold of the Lannisters in her hair by some trick of sun, though her face had that northern pallor that never seemed to warm. She looked at him as if swallowing glass. He smiled very slightly at her, the way a cat smiles at a bird, and then looks away as if uninterested. He did not linger. He did not leer. He did not mention that he could make her bend to receive his glove in public if he desired. He did not desire. Or rather he did, but he did not. After, in the shade of the Sept's side garden among lemon trees that never quite took to the city's soil, Margaery walked with him where the air trembled with bees. The leaves cast coin-shaped shadows on her throat. He found himself speaking of the Bays shoals, and she listened with such focus that he had to remind himself not to tell her the truth. that he knew nothing of shoals and little of ships beyond, sink or sail or burn. Your speech made them less afraid, she said. They will forgive much if they are unafraid. I did not mention forgiveness, he said. I spoke of vows, which is a type of forgiveness. She cut a lemon leaf from its stem with one nail and crushed it between finger and thumb for the scent. It is not, he said, and moved close enough to her to see the pattern of green in her eyes, a darker ring around the light. She lifted her gaze to him, pleased at the spine of argument in his voice. And yet, they believed you would be merciful. They will believe, he said. What I make them believe. Her smile was complete and empty, and something in between. If she feared him, she hid it so well he could almost believe she did not. It made him hunger for a shape of fear he could see, but he saw the garden, the gentled city beyond, the ripple of Tywin's counsel in the day's fabric, and made himself swallow that hunger as if it were unripe fruit. That night, the torches were a line of small suns along the gallery. In his bedchamber, the walls held tapestries of kings who had allowed their artists the kindness of heroism. Joffrey let the servants undress him and dismiss themselves. He moved to the window and looked down at the courtyard where the guards changed with a choreography he had not ordered, but enjoyed as if he had. Somewhere, he knew, in one of the unused rooms, his crossbows slept. He had not gone to them in 2 weeks. That abstinence tasted like victory to someone else, he supposed. To him, it tasted like thirst. A knock came, and he said nothing. The door opened anyway, which meant it was his mother. Cersei stood in lamplight as if carved there, a wine cup held like a prop. The years had not yet taken her beauty, but something in it had sharpened. She inspected the room for watchers who were not present, then stepped inside. You please your grandfather, she said without preamble. I please my city, he answered blandly. You please your grandfather, she repeated, and came to stand where she could look at him without craning. You obey him. He turned his head until their faces were nearly mirrored. I am counseled. I counseled you, she said. Once. He considered the past tense, and found that it was hers. You still do, he said, allowing her that much, though both knew that in counsel she was answered now instead of obeyed. And I listen. She put her cup on the table with more sound than needed. He will not always be here. Tyrion will not always be here. The Tyrells will not always feed this city. When they are gone, when they betray you, when they bore you, when they die, who remains? Your blood remains. Your mother remains. Thou. He did not say that blood had many ways of leaving. He did not say that he admired the Tyrell method, a smile that carried knives. Of course, he said, and meant neither comfort nor compliance by it. She saw as much. She placed her hand on his cheek and did not find a softness to grip. Joffrey slept and dreamed of a stag wearing a man's crown whose antlers grew and grew until they pierced the walls of the keep and lifted stones like bread crusts. When he woke, it was still dark, and he could not remember whether the stag had bellowed or laughed. The wedding grew like a tide you could not ignore. Seamsters worked until their needles bent. Bakers cursed as the price of flour moved like a hair. The Tyrells sent sweet things and clever things. The Lannisters sent heavy ones. If someone had measured the city by music, it would have been found to be retuned. A higher, quicker pitch, the strings drawn taut. Sir Loras sparred in the yard with a grace that made watching him feel impolite, even to those who had never been polite in their lives. Lady Olenna moved among the merchants like a queen without a throne. Her courtesy so honest it made men confess more than they wished. The bells were tested and tested again, and the septon practiced pronouncing the king's names so that they fell with the right weight. Joffrey found to his own surprise that he did not want the dwarfs. He had liked the idea. One dressed as each of the kings of his time. A little war stomped around the dais for laughter, for shame, for the pleasure of humiliating men who could not rise higher than his knee. But he imagined the faces watching him watch the dwarfs, and he imagined how his grandfather's lids would lower. He imagined Margaery's hand going still in his, the way a doe goes still at a twig snap. He told the master of revels to find minstrels instead, and a troupe of acrobats who could climb ropes without anchors, human flags that did not require him to sneer. He felt cheated and relieved in the same breath, and did not allow the feeling to remain long enough to name it. On a day of ritual lustration before the wedding, Oberyn Martell arrived with a face like a blade sheathed partly for charity. Joffrey knew him at once, not because he had memorized the features of the Lords of Dorne, but because the man wore danger without apology. He bowed with a grace only slightly mocking. "Your grace," he said. "I have brought sunshine with me. You will find it stings." "I am pleased you have come," Joffrey said, at the practiced pitch. He was careful not to look at Tywin as he spoke. "We shall make peace look well on us." "Peace looks well on very few men," Oberyn said. "On kings it looks like judgment," Joffrey answered, not sure where the words came from until he tasted his grandfather's instruction in them. Oberyn's mouth tilted. It was not approval. Margaery took Oberyn's measure with a rapidity that made Joffrey briefly fearful for her, as if she were a small bird perched near a snake. Then he saw that she liked snakes and could hold them calmly. They spoke. The man laughed. When he left, Margaery's grandmother said something dry with a pomegranate seed in it. Joffrey felt like a boy eavesdropping, and made himself care only a little. The night before the wedding, Tywin sent for him to dine alone. A candle between them made their faces two halves of the same coin, one side minted and worn smooth, the other side catching light greedily. The hand cut his meat as if the animal had been an enemy. He did not drink much wine. "You will greet each house with equal courtesy," Tywin said. "You will not slight anyone whose name I recite now." He listed houses Joffrey had never thought about. Small men with narrow lands that had somehow survived all the great crushings of larger banners. "You will allow your bride to be seen to improve you." Joffrey looked up at that, as if the admission had been a slap. "Improve me?" Tywin did not look away. "Kings are not born, Joffrey. They are made every morning and unmade every night." Then down. He wanted to throw his goblet to hear the smash. He wanted to spit wine into the candles until they hissed black. He said, instead, "And what am I in the making of me?" "You are the man who can let advice enter his ear and exit through his tongue without lessening himself," Tywin said. "You are the man who does not need to keep proving he is a man." It was a cruelty, like lifting a child by the ear and putting him where he could see himself in the mirror. It was also true enough to make his jaw hurt. He cut his bread and found he had not noticed its heat and that his fingers were burning. He did not wince. "And if I am tempted?" "You will be," Tywin said. "Every hour. Take your temptations to a room without witnesses. Break them there." The wedding day rose bright and merciless. A wind off the bay made the banners stand so stiff they looked carved. The sceptre was white as a tooth against the sky. Joffrey wore gold, like a forge had cooled on him, and Margaery wore flowers so cunningly sewn they might have been alive. Even the stones had been scrubbed as if they were under inspection. The vows were said, the wine tasted by men who had no names in the histories. Rings were set. It took time, all of it. And the time itself was part of the spectacle. It let the city draw breath, realize a king could speak for long minutes without ordering anything cut from a body. He looked at Tyrion only once during the feasting, and when he did, he found his uncle's glance already there. Quick, bright, and then gone. He did not push a goblet on the man, did not call for another song to mock his stature. He did not ask for a knife that might be planted in words. He took instead a tour through the hall, guiding Margaery by her fingers, pausing at tables to say things he had been taught to say, and occasionally, things of his own. Small, sharp compliments that made rough men grin. He felt strangely seen, not as a lord to be feared, not as a boy to be indulged. Something else, something made of these two with a third thing woven between. He did not like the uncertainty. He liked how people leaned toward him when he spoke, because they wanted to want him. It occurred to him that he had several ways of being wanted. He shelved that thought for later. Oberyn Martell approached late, moving like a story told in a low room. He bowed to Margaery first, then to the king. "You wear your crown as if it sits lightly." Joffrey felt the crown's weight then in his neck. "As if it belongs," he said. "It may," Oberyn said. "There are craftsmen who can make anything look fitted." Margaery took his arm. Prince Oberyn, have you seen the acrobats? They defy gravity like liars. Now. He smiled at her word and allowed himself to be led. But his gaze cut over Joffrey's shoulder toward where Tywin sat like a lion placed at a table for the amusement of children. Their eyes met for a long, purely private moment that had no room for any other. In the days after, Joffrey discovered that the world assembled itself around him differently. He was a married man and a spectacle, dampened by completion. The city could not make a prophecy of him with the same hungry ease. There were petitions to hear, always petitions. He sat on the damnable chair in the Hall of Nine and learned the itch that comes of being trapped in one's skin for hours while men and women rehearsed their miseries for him. A baker had been cheated by a miller. A swaggering guard had taken a boy's dog because his daughter fancied it. A hedge knight with 6 too many dents in his helm wanted lands that no one could give him. Joffrey found that people often brought him their lives, when what they wanted was either coin or a momentary replacement for a god. He learned to give one and not the other. Twice he wanted to order a tongue cut out. Once at least it would have been prudent. An agitator who cloaked sedition as prophecy, a stinking man with eyes like fever. He imagined the hall's attention sharpening to a point and piercing the figure. He imagined the relief. He imagined his grandfather's stillness turning into a shaking he would never show. He ordered the man sent to the wall instead. He felt annoyed with himself for choosing a mercy that smelled like strength but was still, unmistakably, a mercy. Margaery's glance at him afterward was pure, bright pride, the pride of a teacher. He almost snarled to spoil it. He did not. News came on damp wings. When Tywin brought the raven-scratched parchment to the council and laid it down as neatly as a platter of meat, Joffrey could smell the iron in the ink. He watched his grandfather's face and saw nothing. He watched Varys' face and saw a careful calm. He watched Tyrion's face and saw nothing but a covering thin as dragonfly wing. From the twins, Tywin said, Lord Walder has been generous. The words were so bland, they curdled in the ear. Joffrey felt a spark leap in him. Satisfaction, retribution, something crude. He pictured a king in the north with wolf's blood choking. He pictured a red wetness that would make songs. He pictured the pride of House Stark collapsing like a tent whose poles had been quietly sawed half through. He wanted to lift his goblet and laugh, not as a boy who delighted in pain, but as a king who savored closure. You will say nothing, Tywin said in that tone that informed stone of its duty to stay stone. Joffrey turned his head very slowly toward his grandfather. He found Cersei's eyes sliding sideways at him, urging, measuring. He found Margaery looking down Sansa's row, assessing what kindness would be needed, and how to make it public without ugliness. He found Sansa's hands clenched so tight the knuckles shone. He could almost hear her father's voice in her head. He thought, briefly, and with a clarity that pierced him like cold water, of the metal taste that comes when you bite your tongue hard enough to keep blood in your own mouth. He did not speak. He allowed his face to settle into a gravity he had never liked the feeling of. He watched, instead, his grandfather take his place as the man who would do the talking that did not wish to be said. After, he went to the yard and shot targets until the string of the bow burned his fingers. He sent a boy to fetch his leather glove, because he would not bleed in front of the guards. That night the city carried the news under its shirts like a hot coin. It passed from palm to palm. In brothels and kitchens and cellars where the damp made old women's joints groan, the tale grew horns and sloughed them. It acquired invented details and impaled them on its spine. Grief moved through the streets with less noise than joy, but with a longer reach. Margaery went to the sept with her ladies and lit candles. Joffrey did not. He let the candles be lit for him, and understood this would be counted against him by people who wanted kings who prayed. He did not care. He wanted his arrows to fly straight. Sansa wept where no one could see her, except that Tyrion could see anyone in a room because he understood the geometry of crowds. He approached her, not as a husband, but as a man who could offer her a chair when her knees stopped being reliable. He did not touch her arm. I'm sorry, he said simply. He had the good sense not to say for your brother, because the word your might splinter her. He said it again and meant it. She nodded as if hearing a foreign language. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words cost her something that would not be repaid. Joffrey passed them in the gallery later and forced his gaze to pass over their heads. He neither taunted nor comforted. He had been told, once, that kings need not own every word in a realm. He took that counsel and found it tasted like copper. Oberyn Martell came to the council and did not smile for 3 days. Joffrey felt those days move through the Red Keep like a bad wind. Tywin spoke to the prince at length in a private chamber where no one could hear. When the doors opened, both men looked as if nothing had happened, which meant something had. The weeks that followed were a training of muscles. Joffrey learned to place a signature without blot. He learned which merchants lied with their hands, and which with their eyes, and which with their breath. He learned how to stand so that a hall became his, without him having to knock on it with his voice. He learned one cannot drink as much as one likes, and keep the mind one wishes to have. He found that his mother had become quieter. He found that Margaery had become less gentle, and more full of a careful gaiety that could serve as armor or offering depending on angle. He found that he did not miss the dwarfs. Boredom still pricked him like nettles, and made him long for a cry in a dark room. When it grew too thick, he went to the kennels at night. The dogs did not fear him. They knew something movable inside his stillness. They recognized it the way animals recognize hunger. He bent his head among them until their breath dampened his throat, and his hair smelled of their world. He did not torment. He did not yet. He promised himself the restraint as a wager against something larger that he wanted without being able to name it. When he met with the envoys from the Iron Bank of Braavos, their faces smooth as a tabletop and their voices like oiled hinges, Tywin let him sit and watch without speaking until the last quarter hour, when he leaned toward his grandson and said, "Soft enough to be private. Ask them what they fear." Joffrey looked at the men who spoke in sums and debt and guarantees. He thought of the way fear taste is salt and metal and useful. "What you fear," he said, "is that we will learn to live without your coin." They blinked. Applause grew. The room grew quiet. In it, Joffrey saw his grandfather's finger move once, as if tapping ash from a cigar he did not hold. "What we fear," the bald one said after that pause, "is that you will learn to live without anyone's coin. Then you will need me to need you," Joffrey said. "That is a kind of love," the Braavosi said, expressionless. After they were gone, Tywin handed Joffrey a sheet of numbers, as if passing a sword. "Your minds, your grace. You will have to learn to love arithmetic before the year has turned." "I love killing men who add badly," Joffrey said without heat. Tywin's look said, "Yes, and?" "Learn both," he replied, and turned away as if to hide the small satisfaction that rose when he watched a boy's vanity wrap around the right kinds of difficulty. In the Queen's apartments, Margaery looked over plans for an orphan's feast in a square that had once hosted hangings. She wore her hair unbound, an intimacy that was not intimate, and she held a charcoal stick that smudged her finger. "If we place the tables here," she said, sketching lines, "we can leave an alley clear for soldiers to move if we need them. It will look generous and remain safe. Nendaros." "It will look," Joffrey said, "like I am gentle. It will look like you are wise enough to buy hearts cheaply." She smiled, challenging him to be offended. "I prefer to take hearts," he said, and she did not flinch. "Then take them this way and keep them." She brushed his sleeve with the back of her hand deliberately, as if adjusting him, as if to remind him that certain appetites could be redirected like streams. In those days, Varys visited him in a very slow way, the way a smell moves through a house. He often had nothing to ask and nothing to say, and those visits were the ones that drew Joffrey to speak. "They begin to hum," Varys murmured once, looking down from the gallery onto a courtyard where carpenters raised a scaffold for repairs. "When the king's wishes make sense as a song." "What if my wishes do not sing?" Joffrey asked, curious. "Then people will hum another tune loudly until yours cannot be heard," Varys said without malice. "What tune would you hum if mine goes silent?" Joffrey asked. Varys smiled with a sadness not quite counterfeit. "I have no voice for singing, your grace. I am a listener." Later that evening, in the practice yard, he fought with a blunted sword against Sir Adam Marbrand, and got a welt on his forearm that swelled like a fruit under the skin. It pleased him perversely to feel pain earned honestly. He almost sought the humiliation of losing, and then, seeing his grandfather watching from the balcony, he did not. He fought carefully and allowed himself to be praised an appropriate amount. Letters came from the wall written by men whose hands had spent more time with axes than quills. They spoke of cold and of things that moved in it. Joffrey almost sent the letters to Pycelle unread. Then he watched Tywin open them and not dismiss them, and he read them himself. The words were clumsy and carried fear like frost. He assigned more grain to be sent north with grim irritation that he hid. He could already hear Littlefinger divining a way to sell some of it twice. He thought of his anger as fuel. He did not burn it publicly. He found himself in the Godswood one morning, an impulse, wave-like, and stood among trees that had learned to grow without understanding why a city had been built around them. Sansa was there. It almost made him laugh, that the only place he could not be seen was a place devoted to being seen by gods he did not believe in. She did not flee. That was interesting. He had not known whether he wanted her to. "My lady," he said, and the phrase felt absurd in his mouth, like eating something that turned back into flour on the tongue. "Your grace," she said, and could not quite make her curtsy be more than muscle memory. He looked at the heart tree and at the face carved in it, and thought of what men want wood to tell them when wood can only be wood. "I would not have you suffer," he said, surprising himself. He heard the hoarseness in his own voice and disliked its intimacy. "In public." She blinked slowly, as if the words had passed through many languages to reach her. "That is a kindness," she said, and stared at the ground because the alternative was to look at him and consider telling him what kind of kindness he had just defined. "You are wed to my uncle," he said. "You will be treated with every—" He paused. He refused to say respect, just as he refused to say mercy earlier. "Consideration." She lifted her head and managed a smile that did not blow away. "Thank you, your grace." Margaery appeared out of the trees, then like a thought one pretends one has always had. She took Sansa's hands and said something gentle and required, and Sansa's posture loosened as if a strap had been unclasped. Margaery looked at Joffrey over Sansa's shoulder. He could not read what she asked. "Trust me, perhaps. Or, watch me do your work for you." He inclined his head ever so slightly and left them together as if it had been his idea. A month after the wedding, a courier arrived from the Vale with letters sealed in blue and white. Littlefinger's eyes followed the seals, the way a hound follows a scent. He came to court dressed simply that day, and his smile was the soft one, the one that made women tell him things. He was permitted to kiss the Queen's hand. He was told to wait. Tywin invited him to dine and asked him questions that were like mousetraps disguised as sweetmeats. After, Joffrey found himself hungry for no reason. When he asked his grandfather what the man wanted, Tywin said, "What he always wants. The step above the one he stands on. The one he is convinced he deserves." "And what does he deserve?" Joffrey asked. "To be watched," Tywin said, and poured wine that he did not drink. That winter, or what the city would call winter, a soft thing compared to the iron wall of cold that dropped on the true north, did not yet arrive. Instead, days stretched mild. The harbor licked ships with friendly green. Children played on stairs and were not beaten for it. The Red Keep absorbed small shocks like an old ship taking waves on the bow, steady because it had learned how not to panic. Joffrey noticed that people began to look him in the face more often when he walked among them. Not with love, not with fear, with a scrutiny that contained a possibility. He wondered if this was power, this ability to become a blank on which they wrote what they needed, so long as he did not contradict them. When he did feel the old itch, he fed it small things. He allowed himself to watch a rat drown in a barrel, and did not stop it. He pressed his nail into his palm when a petitioner lied blatantly and enjoyed the pain. He took his crossbow once and shot melons in a kitchen until the cook cried. He did it at an hour when only 3 people would know. He rewarded them each the next day for a different reason, so they would not connect the coins to the melons. He kept himself, he told himself, in training. In the West, men said the rains had been strange. In the Riverlands, smoke still braided itself into the sky over places where barns once stood. In Dorne, the prince wrote elegant letters that made compliments and contained neither warmth nor threat at the surface. In the North, crows wheeled. In the East, rumors of dragons were stories told to frighten and comfort in equal measure. Even Tywin's mouth tightened when those stories crossed a map. "Children," he said once, in private, where he permitted such scorn to be shaped by a sneer. "Raise monsters so that the day's chores look brave. And if the monsters grow?" Joffrey asked, insulted by the word children without knowing why. "Then," Tywin said, "we will outnumber them with gold and swords." "And fire?" Joffrey asked, thinking of wildfire's sweet-smelling heat. "Fire burns both ways," Tywin said, and looked at his grandson as if measuring flint. One morning, a line of brown-robed men made its way up Aegon's high hill, walking bareheaded in cool air, murmuring prayers for the strength to be poor. Joffrey watched them from the window of the council room and felt Cersei's eyes prick his cheek. "Vermin," she said. "They creep in under doors, and you don't notice until the wine tastes of dirt. They notice when the wine is missing," Tyrion said from his chair. "When bread grows thin, the gods grow fat." Tywin did not look away from his parchment. "We are not arming monks," he said, as if he had been asked whether to salt their porridge or give them daggers. The matter died. The monks continued to murmur. In another world, Joffrey suspected, this would have become a fire. In this one, it became background noise. Margaery leaned over a balcony that afternoon and watched the same procession with compassion that was not uncalculating. Joffrey put his hand at the small of her back and felt, through silk, how slender she was. Not fragile. A whip can be slender. "What would you ask of the gods if you believed they answered?" he said. She did not turn. "That I never make you feel small in front of your men." He laughed. Genuine, and could not smell the cruelty in it. She did not flinch. When she turned toward him, her expression was bright and empty and full. She knew many ways of being a queen. That evening, in Tywin's rooms that smelled of oiled leather and fresh-cut paper, a letter lay that none of the others had seen, its seal broken, its script tight as a miser's mouth. Joffrey could see how his grandfather's jaw moved, not with anger exactly, with the fact of work. A sellsword company across the narrow sea. Tywin said as if reading the names of saints he did not believe in. They call themselves golden. Everything calls itself golden. Will they come? Joffrey asked. Everything comes eventually, Tywin said, and set the letter under a paperweight carved in a lion shape. Joffrey thought then of seas and of a girl with white hair whose name he had never spoken aloud because names can be conjurations. He thought of how people make myths to bend their fear. He thought of a city that had begun to refrain from flinching. He thought of the weight of a crossbow in an empty room. He felt a strange affection for the iron bells and their rust, for the gulls and their stupid hunger, for the press of bodies below his balcony, and the way they looked up in a way that made him feel taller without having to stand on his toes. In the middle of the night, he woke and went to the window and opened it and let the damp come in. The city spoke quietly to itself. He rested his forehead against the cold stone. He had done nothing merciful that did not serve him. He had done nothing cruel he could not swallow in secrecy. He had listened. He found that the listening had left a mark on his face that made it look older to him. He had not yet tested its edges. He would. Dawn came late, clouded, an old coin rubbed thin. Joffrey dressed without help and went to the small council where men waited with sum and rumor, map and complaint, and a day lay before him like a board with pieces whose moves he had only begun to understand. He took the chair and rested his hand near, but not on the knife, and watched his grandfather watch him. The room heard his breath, Outside, across water the color of tarnished copper, ships moved like slow thoughts. In the far north, crows circled a spire of ice and waited. In a warm palace across the narrow sea, a girl looked toward a horizon and did not yet know the shape of the king who was finally learning to listen. A guard knocked and brought in a petitioner out of order. A woman with a face like a line drawn against the wind. She fell to her knees before the king and did not cry. "Your Grace," she said in a voice as flat as a field under snow. "Men came and took my husband for a thief. I do not ask for his return." "What do you ask?" Joffrey said, perhaps more quickly than he should have. "For the dog they took when they took him," she said, "so the children will stop waking in the night." Tyrion made a small sound of surprise, like a man who has seen a coin except a new face. Joffrey was aware of Varys looking at his hands. Tywin waited. "Return the dog," Joffrey said, and felt the ridiculousness of power, how large it is and how it fits around small things. Then he looked at Tywin, and Tywin nodded once. And the woman took her head out of the dust and wept this time, which was worse. "Attend," Tywin said later quietly, when the hall had emptied. "This is the labor you do when you do not bleed. It makes men want to go to war for you when you ask it." "I will not ask," Joffrey said, feeling the shape of daring move under his tongue like a new tooth. "You will," Tywin said, "because you will have to." When he went down to the yard, the dogs were sleeping, one eye always open to appraise. He strode past without stopping, past the target boards, past the archery butts, out to where the training dummy leaned in the corner like a man who has drunk too much. He raised a sword and brought it down again, until someone fetched him a leather glove without his having to ask. He did not count the blows. He did not look up to see who watched. He kept going until the hunger in him had become something cleaner and duller, and in that dullness he could feel the morning's work settle like a mantle he could tolerate. In the days that followed there were more letters. A raven from Roose Bolton with that peculiar courtesy that concealed a knife assured them of winter marches and oaths. Another from Walder Frey with an inventory of generous acts disguised as bills. A neat missive from Dorne that mentioned the weather as if a poem had been sanding the words. Whispered news of a fleet that had turned back before storms. Another whisper that said a red priest had seen a crown melt on a brow of iron. Joffrey read them all and felt his own brow in the mirror of a polished plate, and laughed under his breath because laughter sometimes was the only thing that made sense. "Men will forget you are a boy," he told himself, "if you forget it first." On a morning when the city smelled of new bread and sweat and tar, when Margaery sang to children and the bells behaved, Joffrey stood again on the terrace above Maegor's holdfast. The gulls were insolent and beautiful. The bay sloshed its green tongue and showed its filth without apology. He heard Tywin's step before he saw him. He did not turn. He allowed the man who had taught him to listen to see a profile that could be carved in coin. "Grandfather," he said when the silence had filled enough to matter, "you will say there is news." "Say it." Tywin set a paper on the parapet between them. "Stannis Baratheon has gone north," he said, the words placed like stones across a stream. "There is fighting at the wall. It will change things." Joffrey imagined the top of the world and a cold that could not be written down. He imagined men like ants at the edge of a god's table. He imagined the line of the realm, thin and long and frayed, and the way one tug somewhere could make the whole weaving ship. He did not feel fear. He felt interested. "We will watch," he said. "We will choose our moment. We will be ready." Tywin looked at him and saw a young man wearing a crown as if it had become his skull. He nodded once. Those old hawk lines deepened in the light. Below them, the city labored. Above them, the air was full of bright gulls and the squeal of their hunt. Far away, beyond the curve of the world, a girl with white hair turned her face toward wind. Between them all, a boy who had decided to listen began to learn what he would do when listening no longer served him, as well as the sound of his own voice. "Hey, Ka." The city took on a calmer noise in those weeks, a hum that gathered itself around work done in good weather, scaffolds talking in wood knocks, or stroking the green back of the bay, the clack of dice on barrelheads shaken with less desperation. In the mornings, a thin mist lay in the low streets like a shawl, Someone had been too drunk to remove, and by noon, the sun pulled it to tatters. The Red Keep held the light on its shoulders and did not flinch. Joffrey walked the repairs as if they were lines he had written. Men looked up from mortar with whitened hands and stared because a king's boots were on their planks. A few smiled the way men smile at a stray coin, half ashamed of wanting it. He did not feel warmed by the smiles. He felt a steadying in him that he did not know how to name. Margaery went with him sometimes, veiled and laughing, because the dust tried to make a meal of her throat. The masons near her stood straighter and set stones more carefully, as if hoping to impress a clever girl rather than a king. She made them want her gratitude. He watched that with curiosity that had a corner of hunger, and then turned away to count timbers, to ask a foreman how long lime took to cure and to wait. For once, to hear the answer whole. Tywin brought him to a cold chamber one gray afternoon, a room that had once been used for cooling wine in summer, and now cooled men. The High Septon stood there with his rings and his fat and his breath that smelled of cloves. He had come with a cortege of candles and faces that rehearsed devotion. His eyes were small and clever in the wet flesh. "We would ask," the man said in the tone of someone who says the thing he intends to be granted has already been granted by heaven, a reinvigoration of the king's grace to the faith. The poor beg oaten bread. The modest want walls. The city wants order, Tywin said neatly. Order, murmured the High Septon, with love around it. We have given grain, Joffrey said, the words even. We have scrubbed the steps of Baelor. We have paid for bells to call men to prayer, or to call them to their meals. However one prefers to think of it. The man's smile did not reach his eyes. The seven ask for hands as well as purses. The poor love to feed the gods with their strength, a sword that defends holiness. No, Tywin said, before the words could assemble themselves into a movement. The faith has a tongue, not a sword. The High Septon's glance moved to Joffrey, calculating whether a boy's shoulder might pivot around that word. Margaery had warned Joffrey that certain kinds of men believed boys could be turned like weathercocks by soft wind. He kept his face open and made himself appear reachable, a thing a supplicant might try to climb. The gods would be honored if the king favored them with old customs, the man said gently, making old sound like safe. In days of trouble, the poor fellows. The days of trouble, Joffrey said, have not ended, which is why you will continue to feed the poor with bread and as many words as you like, and not with knives. Bentran. There was a high, faint shiver in the room, the kind that comes when two instruments agree. The High Septon bowed so correctly it might have been a threat. He dabbled his fingers in the bowl set for him, and murmured a blessing that did not know where to land. After he had gone, Tywin moved a sheet of parchment, a finger's breadth to the left, as if that tiny act were a lesson in government. They will return, he said. When a city grows fat, men shave piety to make armor. And when it grows thin, Joffrey said, they sharpen the armor on their hunger. Tywin said nothing, which was approval's form in that room. Lady Olenna wandered into the queen's rooms as if she were lost, and had merely turned left into magnificence. The apartment smelled of rosewater and charcoal, the hearths banked to keep the women in silk from going red-cheeked. The Queen of Thorns took Margaery's hand as if she had discovered it new. Your husband did not humiliate dwarfs at his wedding, she said as if remarking on the weather, and I suppose I must be grateful for that. I had 77 ways to remove a boy from a world he would make uglier. I find myself down to 30. Margaery's smile was real and defensive at once. He is not the boy you were told to expect. Who told me to expect him? Everyone, the old woman said. She pinched the air. A little snake that will bite because he likes the taste. I do not hate snakes. I resent wasting good courtiers teaching them not to bite publicly. He learns because it pleases his grandfather to see him open his ears. That is not the same as growing a soul. Bam? Margaery moved her hands over the unrolled square of parchment on her lap, a plan of tables and trestles and tents. I do not need a soul to be a husband. I need a mind and a preference for stability over spectacle. You say stability like another girl might say jewels, Olenna said, amused. He looks at you as a man looks at a falcon that might return. I suppose that is something. Danny? He looks at me as if I make his restraint valuable, Marguerite said, and did not pretend she had not noticed. He is clever in his appetites. That can be taught into shape. It can be fed to a famine, Olenna said, if one is not careful. Her fingers tapped the parchment. Keep the soldiers out of the children's sight at the feast. Let them be there, but let them be invisible until they must not be. They will line the alley behind the pies, Marguerite said, tapping a tiny square. There are barrels there to lean a spear upon without letting the point show. If trouble comes, it will test only my table, not the city. Then to see you. Good, said Olenna. If a blade flashes in daylight at your side, the whole realm will spend a year talking about your blood instead of your bread. In the gardens where the lemons tried and mostly failed, Tyrion shared a bench with Prince Oberyn Martell. And their wine looked like one kind of sunset and their eyes like another. The Dornishman sat with his back to a wall, a gesture that in him seemed like taste rather than caution. It is a curious sensation, Oberyn said, to sit in the den of a beast and find the straw swept, the bones picked up, the beast's temper gentled by someone outside the den entirely. Tywin? Tyrion asked. Or the girl with the smile? Oberyn's mouth crooked. Both. The boy himself. Is not the boy I watched from afar. Tyrion looked over a hedge at the pale rectangle of sky. He has learned that a crown is a bridle as well as a circlet. Bridles break, Oberyn said. He let the wine sit on his tongue a long moment. I did not come for the boy. You came for an old wound, Tyrion said, and did not pretend to be stupid. Oberyn's eyes went to the farthest edge of green, beyond the keep, beyond the city, to where the horizon curved as if it wished to hide what lay under it. I came because a woman screams in my sister's voice when I sleep. I came because a man in your colors wore my grief like a cloak. I came because we will all go on pretending if no one refuses. Lenderall. You will find, Tyrion said, that refusing in King's Landing is usually a way of announcing you are ready to starve. I am not asking, Oberyn said quietly. When the day comes, I will not ask. I will say his name in a place where the wall's ears cannot pretend they misheard me. Tywin will not give you Sir Gregor, Tyrion said. He does not give up tools because they are sharp. Oberyn set his cup down very carefully on the bench, almost absently, as one sets down a precious thing, because both hands are required for something else. Then perhaps I take him. Perhaps I make it a question the boy must answer. Tyrion thought of the knife edge on which the city's quiet had balanced these last months. He thought of Marguerite curving the public gaze towards sweetness and Tywin angling it toward stone. He thought of Cersei's eyes, redder lately, and the way she had taken to speaking with the Kettleblacks as if they were gentlemen. His sister would welcome a fire, any fire that burned the curtains she disliked. If you force a spectacle, Tyrion said, you will win your justice and lose your city. I will win my sister's ghost a bed, Oberyn said. As for the city always survives. It learns to wear ashes like beads. That night, Cersei sat in her apartments with her shoes off, and her hair combed out by a thin girl who was not permitted to speak without being asked. Her wine was too sweet, and she drank it because it felt like time could be poured. Sir Osmond Kettleblack had teeth like a man who laughed at the dull wit of others and liked his own. He stood by the fire as if he were a friend instead of something a woman buys with compliments. They say, he said, the Queen's feast will draw all the rats into one square. Seems a pity not to bring cats. Cersei's mouth tilted. Cats? She asked lazily. I see only dogs. Begging your pardon, Osmond said, not sounding as if he begged for anything. Dogs do not climb ropes or go where bread is passed from hand to hand. Cats do. Slip between legs, see? You want coin, Cersei said, bored. I want, Osmond said, to be useful to a queen who has found herself set aside in certain chambers. She could have had him whipped for that. She could have had him pressed into a corner and kissed because it would taste like power. She did neither. She looked at him long enough to let him feel that she might do both. Be useful, she said, in ways that leave no footprints. He bowed, a little too low, and left. Cersei drank a different wine, one that had oak in it and a taste like teeth. The girl combed her hair until the snarls surrendered. Cersei watched her own eyes in the mirror with an attention that would have cut gold. The square chosen for the orphan's feast had the bones of the old gallows still buried under it. When workmen dug to set the trestles, their shovels knocked on history. Margaery walked the lines in a plain gown that announced she could afford to be plain. Children gathered in front of her and pressed like a tide on low sand. Joffrey watched from a half-built balcony that would be slung with garlands later, and judged whether the guard placements would please Tywin. He adjusted 2 by 6 steps and 1 by telling a sergeant to cough when he passed a certain corner. The sergeant did not understand, but he coughed. The bowman in the angle of the lane turned his head to look, and Joffrey saw, just like that, the future span between an alley mouth and a queen's shoulder. When the pies came, the smell rose like a prayer the gods might actually hear. The children squealed and clapped, a sound so honest it almost angered Joffrey by its naivete. He forced his fingers to loosen in the glove. Margaery bent and spoke to a girl with a nose scraped raw from a fall, and the girl nodded solemnly as if she'd been made a lady for a breath. It happened in the second hour, when the pies were half eaten, and a fiddler had set himself to making old men remember their knees. A man stepped out of an alley that did not belong to him. He had made himself look like a man whose knees knew honest work. He held a clay pot, as if it were simply a bowl of stew. Margaery's eyes went to him because someone moved in her periphery, and she had learned to look where movement was. The man's mouth was set in a way that men's mouths are set when they are talking themselves past fear. The clay pot arced, a clumsy throw with too much shoulder. Joffrey saw it in the way one sees 2 dice scuttle and feels at once whether 7 is coming. He did not shout for all of them to duck. He did not call for the line to loose. He said, in a voice that had learned to command in an ordinary room, "Left line. Down. Right line, take him standing. No arrows." Then the one. 2 shields went up like doors, and the pot glanced from iron, and broke at the feet of a boy who started, and then stared dumbly at the yellow smear that was not wildfire. That was only piss, and something worse meant to humiliate and frighten. The man ran because men who have done a stupid brave thing often run slow at first, and then too fast. A guard in the alley put his truncheon out like a shepherd's crook and hooked the back of the man's knee. He fell. The right line flowed like honey, and then became stone. Margaery lifted 2 children because their eyes had grown suddenly old, and she refused to let them stay old on her square. There was no blood. There was a noise like a crowd realizing it has not been chosen to panic. Joffrey felt a thread inside him stretch and not break. He wanted to have the man's face cut, and the cut salted. He wanted to stand him on a barrel and lecture him. He wanted to make a joke that would be quoted in brothels by men who wished they were cruel. He did none of those things. He had the man dragged, not paraded, to a stone bench, and sat down himself with the sun in his face, and the stink of spilt stew in his nose. "Your name," he said. The man stared at the ground. He said a name that could have belonged to 100 men. "Who sent you?" The man's mouth twitched. "The gods," he said, and there was something genuine in it, which made it worse. Joffrey thought of monks and their murmuring. He thought of Cersei's scorn. He thought of the High Septon's fingers dripping water he had not earned. He thought of how quickly pity could be a bellwether if one allowed it. "You will go to the dungeons," he said. "You will tell the gold cloaks who paid you to be pious. When you have told them enough, you will go to the wall. If you ever come south again, I will cut off your feet. Bring the children more pie." It was not merciful. It was not cruel. It was a line cut clean. Margaery looked at him and did not smile because smiles are for crowds. Olenna nodded once in a shadowed place. On the walk back up the hill, Joffrey's fingers shook, and he hid them by knotting his glove tighter. Tywin said, "That evening, you did not lose the square." "I did not," Joffrey said, and waited for the knife inside the praise. "You indulged yourself with a speech," Tywin said mildly. "I saved it for later," Joffrey said. "I would like my indulgences salted and kept." Tywin actually smiled then, a sight like seeing a cliff move. "Be careful which you salt," he said. "Certain meats go bad even in winter." Letters brought winter on their backs after that. One spoke of Stannis riding into snow like a man who means to bully the cold into obeying him. Another spoke of a banner of flayed men raised over a keep that had once been a safe place for travelers. The letters smelled of clean ice and dirty knives. A raven with a wingtip missing carried courtesy from Roose Bolton that slid like a snake along the lines of ink. Walder Frey wrote as if the Red Fork were a ledger. The Iron Bank sent figures that were patient as the sea. Joffrey signed what he had to sign. He delayed what could be delayed. He looked at Sansa Stark sometimes and tried not to look like he was looking. She wore her grief like a garment that had been washed too many times. It had thinned, but it had not lost its shape. She went to the God's Wood alone or with Margaery. Tywin forbade servants to follow and learn how a northern girl prayed. When the summons came from Dorne, no, not a summons, a courtesy sharpened to a hook, Oberyn asked an audience before the full court. Joffrey sat his chair and felt, as he sometimes did now, less like a boy made into a noise, and more like a noise that had learned a boy's outline. Oberyn wore simple things and defiance like a jewel. "Your Grace," he said, and bowed with the gravity of a man who despises those who demand such effort. "I ask justice. Justice is bought here in coin and patience," Cersei said before Joffrey could open his mouth. Her voice had that new brittle in it, and men who loved the Queen winced or were excited or both. What has Dorne been denied that it dares to make demands in the capital? Oberyn's eyes did not leave the king's face. "My sister," he said. The name he did not say, Aelia, filled the room anyway, bloomed like a cut flower. Her children. The man who did the work with the enthusiasm of a butcher. Allegations, Tywin said, each syllable so crisp it might cut a mouth. "Names," Oberyn said. "I will say them. Gregor Clegane." "Sir." The word sir landed in the hall like spittle. People did not move because men do not move at the sound of a storm when there is not yet rain. Joffrey's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. He could feel the court waiting to see whether he would yelp and chase a cat around the room, or sit and be still like a door. He thought of Dornish spears and of letters in a tidy hand from Sunspear that had mentioned neither anger nor forgiveness. He thought of Tywin's need to make the realm sound like one choir whether it wished to sing or not. He thought of Margaery's breath steadying when he chose stability over spectacle. He lifted his chin an exact inch. "Lord Hand," he said, "what say you?" Tywin did not look at him, which was also a way of honoring him. "The man named is a bannerman of House Clegane. He serves the West. He serves the realm. He has been accused many times by men who have died before they proved their words." "Then the one." "I live," Oberyn said. "You did not see the work," Tywin said, voice like a blade drawn in its scabbard without showing the steel. "You bring grief, not evidence." "I bring wounds," Oberyn said. "We can weigh them." Cersei's mouth twisted in disdain. Varys made himself look sorrowful on behalf of all of them. Tyrion's face did something quick and private and was still again. Littlefinger made careful study of the tapestries, as if they were ledgers that might conceal a prophet. "There is remedy in law," Tyrion said quietly, without looking at Tywin. "A hearing, a demand for trial before the king." "Trial," Cersei said, pouncing, "is for those accused by proof. We are not a stable yard where anyone who brings a kick can set the dogs on a man." Oberyn looked at Joffrey and let him feel the weight of a prince's stare. "Your Grace," he said, soft now, "the realm will call whatever you do justice if it is called by your voice. If you deny me, I will leave your city with my grief intact and my allies counted. If you grant me a hearing and the man refuses to answer, I will leave your city with my grief quieter and your throne taller in my sight. If you grant me trial by combat and the man accepts, then we shall see if the gods care." Then the word gods turned the air cooler, as if the seven had leaned in. Tywin's eyes were anger held as still as a cup, not to be spilled. Margaery's hand found the cloth of her gown and smoothed it once. Joffrey heard his own breath. He remembered too clearly the aimless savagery in him that wanted something broken. He remembered, just as clearly, the way the square had not turned to panic when he chose a line. "You will have a hearing," he said. He did not look at his grandfather. "Sir Gregor will be summoned to answer. If the hearing proves only that men disagree, you will have trial by combat." It felt like placing his hand on a stove to see if the stories about heat were true. The court breathed, not all at once. Tywin did not turn his head to glare or smile or make his mouth a thin line so the boy would feel the moving of power in the room. He lifted a parchment as if it mattered very much and studied its blank underside until the furor fed itself in whispers, and then, finding it could not find the hand's face for permission, began to starve. When the hearing day came, the sky above the city was a flat pewter, and the gulls had not yet decided whether to carry the mood away or return it in pieces. Sir Gregor Clegane came into the hall like a danger men had tried to name and failed. He did not bow. He did not know how. He looked at the king and saw meat. He looked at Oberyn and saw meat that had knives in it. He looked at Tywin and saw a thing that it would be complicated to try to eat. The words spoken, there were the slow kind of words that cannot be hurried without losing their point. Oberyn spoke the names. He described not what he saw. He had not seen, but what had been seen by men who had died in defending a princess and a babe. He drew a phantom in the air and asked the court to look. Gregor answered, as a man answers when he is spoken to by a buzzing thing. "War," he said once. "Orders." He spoke as if he had learned to put words in his mouth only because men give meat to dogs if they comply. Tywin called a knight who had stood under Gregor in 3 campaigns and said that the man was a boar, but a useful boar. Tyrion asked questions that made no sound when they fell but left dents on the floor. Sansa watched from behind the pale screen set for ladies whose faces were not required by law. Margaery stood at her side with a hand tucked into the crook of her arm, so that the girl could lean without seeming to. A small allowance that could be called charity instead of friendship, if men with sharp ears spoke of it later. Sansa's mouth was tight. The name of Elia lay on her tongue like a stone that had grown warm there. When the hearing had hardened into a wall, and the wall could not be pushed any farther without making a hole that would suck in the entire hall, Joffrey lifted his hand and brought it down. "Trial by combat," he said, and it was not a shout. "We will honor the old law and the gods that hide behind it. Prince Oberyn, have you a champion?" Oberyn smiled and had no pleasure in it, only a delight that was older and meaner. "I am my own. Sir Gregor," Joffrey said, and his tone did not carry curiosity or command, only a formality that wrapped the ugliness like cloth around raw meat. "Will you answer with your own arm?" Gregor grunted, which was a yes. He looked for the first time openly delighted. A child promised to sport with pigs. Tywin stood. He did not speak. He stood as a cliff stands when men shout at the sea. His silence was enormous. Cersei's laughter, brief, sharp, entirely misplaced, flashed and died. Varys looked at his hands. Littlefinger's face went soft as milk. After the hall emptied, Tywin closed the council chamber door with his own hand, which meant that he did not intend to let the gravity in the room dissipate. He set both palms on the table and looked at his grandson with eyes that did not admit blood relation. "You have made a spectacle," he said. "I have made Dorne stay," Joffrey said. He felt the tremor in his chest like the shaking of a bow after a shot. He held it by will until it subsided. They would have left with their grief turned into knives. Now they will watch. Then they will watch a Lannister bannerman bleed, Tywin said. And contempt was not in his voice. A worse thing was there, which was calculation. They will watch a mountain halved and think themselves appeased. They will leave with their grievance hibernating. They will leave without a war in their pockets, Joffrey said. He met the old man's stare and refused his own eyes the relief of dropping. "What did you bring me to this chair to be, if not a maker of lions men can step to without raising dust?" Tywin's mouth moved. It might almost have been amusement, except that no warmth attended it. "If the Dornishman dies," he said, "I will bury half my plans under prudence. If Clegane dies, I will bury the other half under bribes. If both die, I will hold a wake for you in my mind that you will not notice, and I will continue to build anyway. Your choice was Not without argument. It was very nearly praise. Joffrey felt both relief and a bite of triumph he did not show. "I will sit the trial," he said. "You will not," Tywin said. And the fact of the word was heavy. "You will bless the combat after it ends. You will not watch blood settle questions that law could not. I will watch, and I will draw the lines that must be drawn after. Now, then the gods will not have a king for audience," Joffrey said. And when Tywin said nothing, when the old man's face did not shift, Joffrey added, with a recklessness he did not know he had until he heard it, "Grandfather." Something flared in Tywin's eyes then, not anger. There was always anger enough to furnish a room. But a recognition of metal struck against flint and throwing sparks. "Do not let your appetite make you common," he said softly. "Leave spectacle to those who cannot bear the weight of silence." Joffrey did not promise. He turned away because he did not trust his face. In the queen's apartments, Margaery smoothed Sansa's hair with the calm of a woman braiding rope. Before a climb, they could hear the city talking to itself through the open balcony doors, a mutter that rose and fell like a creature dreaming. "He will not sleep," Sansa said, and only after she heard the words did she realize she meant the Prince of Dorne. The thought had been told in her by a memory of dark eyes that had looked past jewels. "Few men sleep when they have turned themselves into the instrument of their anger," Margaery said. "Some sing. Some make love. Some stare at walls until the walls stare back." "What do kings do?" Sansa asked, and it was a child's question that she asked anyway. "They learn not to stare," Margaery said. "Or they are taught not to." She set the comb down and let the northern girl's hair fall like a river. "You must be careful. At the combat. Your face will be watched. Your face is not yours." "It is no one's," Sansa said, and then regretted the bitterness, because it made her feel cold. Margaery's fingers squeezed her wrist. "It is yours when you are alone," she said. "Keep some room for that." Olenna came and dismissed Sansa with a pat on the cheek that was not unkind. When the door had closed, she looked at her granddaughter with a candor she reserved for rooms that smelled of women. "Do not have a child quickly," she said. Margaery did not start. "Grandmother, do not have a child quickly," Olenna repeated. "The boy you have married has learned to admire how clever he is at not behaving like a boy. He will be worse if he thinks he has done the most kingly thing a man can do without using his mind." "Ben Sao." Margaery sat, suddenly very tired. "He listens. He listens because a lion speaks," Olenna said. "When the lion is silent, will he listen to his own silence? Or will he make a noise to remind himself he exists? Women who bear children teach men their own echoes." Margaery closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "I will not be small in front of him," she said. "You will be small next to him," Olenna said. "When the realm looks at you both, learn to be taller sideways." Ben Septiu. Littlefinger left the capital as neatly as he had entered it, with kisses for the queen's hand and oily courtesies to men who would not remember him unless their coin went missing. He had a blue and white seal for the veil tucked where a man keeps comfort. He cast one last glance up at the red keep and did sums, as if the keep were a column of numbers that could be made to add up differently if one shifted an angle. He had spoken to Sansa Datar. He had not taken her hand. He had left her a thought instead, which to him was a better theft. "Your home is no longer where your name began," he had said, standing at a distance far enough to make private words possible in public air. "It is where your story will be believed." "What story?" Sansa had asked, tired. "Any story you can repeat without stammering," he had said. "The Vale has always liked to call itself above the quarrels of the mud. It is mud that makes bread. It is height that makes starvation. A woman with a name like yours will be Thet. I am wed," she had said, and felt the word sit dull in her cheek. "Weddings can be made into funerals when the right bishop coughs," Littlefinger had said too smoothly. "Do not worry. I would never kill a bride." He bowed and left before she could ask him if brides ever killed themselves. On the morning of the trial by combat, the sky put a crust on the city. Even the gulls seemed to choose their places with more calculation, alighting on the crenels, as if betting with one another where blood would fly. Joffrey went to the chapel in Magers where ties are blessed, and swords sometimes get named by men who like to say they name things. He did not kneel. He stood. He looked at the painted faces of the seven, and tried to think of a prayer that would not make him feel foolish. "If you must be present," a voice said behind him. The High Septon, soft-footed when he chose to be. "Pray for mercy." "I will pray for accuracy," Joffrey said. The High Septon widened his eyes as if what the boy had said were sacrilege rather than sense. "Accuracy fills graves," he murmured. "Mercy fills them later," Joffrey said, and walked out without waiting to be marked with oils. He did not sit the combat. He stood in a room that smelled of dust and confinement, and watched the sky instead, while the sound of the city moved like a slow animal. Tywin had forbidden him, and he had obeyed, not because he feared the boy would behave like a brute at a spectacle, but because a king watching justice done by blade made the blade more eloquent than the law. Joffrey paced. Margaery came and sat, and said nothing. He was absurdly grateful for the silence, which did not feel like judgment. In the ring set for such ugliness, Oberyn moved like a man who had been born to music. He wore light. He wore grace. He wore a spear that glittered, as if it too were awake. Gregor wore weight, and a childhood that had never ended. The crowd did not yet know whether to be thrilled or to fear for its windows if blood fell the wrong way. The sand had been raked smooth. The first breath waited. When the news came, it came piecemeal, because men could not agree how to say what they had seen. A boy burst into the room and fell on one knee, and did not remember why he had thought that gesture necessary. "Your Grace," he said to Margaery first, because hers was the face that greeted him. Joffrey found himself offended and laughed at himself for being offended. Then he could not help himself. He stepped forward. "Speak," he said, and the boy's words tumbled and rolled and knocked into each other. "Prince Oberyn," he moved. So fast and spoke, words at the man, over and over, a woman's name, a baby's, and he cut and jumped away. "The big one." He had him. He put him down. The boy gagged. He did not vomit. Joffrey found a pity that surprised him. "Drink," he said curtly, and someone brought water. The second messenger was older, and his voice had the tired calm of one who has carried ugly news for a wage. "Prince Oberyn was winning," he said precisely. Then he wished to make the mountain speak. He got too close to a mouth made for biting. Sir Gregor crushed his head like fruit. He swallowed. "Sir Gregor is down too. Poison." The spear was tipped. Margaery's hand went to her throat, not to swoon but to measure the beat of her own heart, as if to demand that it remain regular. Joffrey closed his eyes once, a slow blink that gave him a darkness to look into. He felt a disappointment that had nothing to do with the Dornishman's death, and everything to do with the clean story turning ugly at the end. He felt relief, and it tasted like disdain. He felt the realm's problems rearrange themselves with a chattering sound. Tywin came in through the private door, a man uses when people must see only the result on his face, and not the work it took to get the result there. He looked down at his grandson and nodded once, an acknowledgement that the boy would not faint. "You will speak," he said calmly. "You will praise courage. You will forbid celebrations. You will send a letter to Sunspear written in your own hand. You will not mention poison." "Then was the spear poisoned?" Joffrey asked. "Yes," Tywin said. "And our man?" "Will die," Tywin said. "Slowly, and I will decide how much the realm needs to witness it." Joffrey considered the shape of a man bigger than fear dying in a room where no one could hear his bones creak. He did not find it poetic. He found it useful. "I will write to Sunspear," he said. "And I will send the sand snakes a gift." Tywin's eyebrows flickered. "Do not imagine you can buy sisters with jewels," he said. "No," Joffrey said. "I would send them books. I have heard they read." Tywin almost smiled. "Send something to their father instead. He will not read it. He will respect that you sent it." Joffrey stood on the balcony that evening when the city breathed the sour sweet fumes of torches and meat and sweat and waiting. He spoke the words written for him with his own cuts in them. He praised courage without attaching it to a name. He forbade celebration as if forbidding joy were a piety. He blessed the dead as if he believed in any god who marked such gestures in clean ink. The crowd listened and did not riot. In a house by the river, a Dornishman broke a chair and wept without noise. In a tower with many locks, a giant groaned. In a room where the air always moved, Varys folded his hands over his soft belly and told himself a story about the uses of spectacle that he would tell no one. That night, Joffrey found himself in the kennel without having decided to go there. The dogs were asleep, as only animals who trust the night can sleep, twitching in dreams made of pursuit. He stared at them. He thought of their simple economies: eat, run, serve, be beaten, sleep, love. He hated and envied them in the same breath. He kicked a loose slat until it splintered, and the noise startled a dog into wakefulness. It came, tail level, waiting to be told if this was a game or a warning. Joffrey let it sniff his hand and then sat on the floor with a care that felt ridiculous. The dog rested its chin on his knee, as if anointing him. He was very still. He let his hand rest on the thick head and marveled that the animal did not flinch. In the days after, Oberyn's body went south, with a dignity Margaery made very visible. Dornish riders, spare and elegantly angry, took him away on a bier dressed as a prince. Joffrey came to the gate and stood in sunlight and did not speak. The men from Dorne looked at him and saw something that would do. Tywin watched them go with eyes that measured distances on a map. The mountain lingered like a bad dream that would not remember itself in daylight. Pycelle came and mumbled, and was dismissed. Qyburn, who had the quiet of a man who has touched anatomy in a way other men call unclean, came and did not ask permission to do the work that would be done anyway. Cersei visited the giant in his sick room with a smile that was an apology to no one. Joffrey did not go. He felt that to stand by the bed of that much dying would give the dead something he did not wish to be without. The letters changed after that. Dorne wrote nothing explodable, only very neat lines that could be read 3 ways and would look respectable from any angle. The Vale wrote something from a woman whose hand had always shaken too much. The words looked like a brook trying to recall its course. The North spoke with Roos's mouth in other men's ravens. The Ironborn did what Ironborn did. They died, and then walked and pretended to rule the dead. A rumor about a brother of Balon rose and fell like a gull in bad wind. Across the narrow sea, stories about a girl with dragons grew feathers each time they flew and returned with new colors. Tyrion drank somewhat less and read somewhat more. He found Joffrey on a balcony one afternoon and stood at his right hand like a well-dressed gargoyle. "I did not expect you to permit the trial," he said, as if commenting on rain. "I did not expect him to lose it," Joffrey said, the truth surprising him as it left. "Your expectations improve," Tyrion said. "You are still learning why men do not do the things they should do, even when they are very agile and very angry. Is there a way to teach them?" Joffrey asked, not quite mocking. "Eggs," Tyrion said, "and the awareness that the world is not interested in your fitness to live in it." Joffrey looked at him sidelong. "You sound like a man who expects to be killed by a miscalculation." "I am a man who expects to keep his head because it is too expensive to cut off," Tyrion said cheerfully, and took a drink that made his mouth grimace. "Sansa is sadder in a way that does not show. You should send her a book, too." "I'm not sending books to women as if I were a septon with comfortable hands," Joffrey said. "Send her a needle," Tyrion said dryly. "She used to sew swords into words when she was small." Joffrey did not reply. That night, he looked at the coins minted with his face and wondered whether he looked like a man Sansa would spit on if she were permitted to spit. He put the coins in a drawer and did not look again for several days. Cersei found new ways to be busy. She visited the great septi with jewelry that made the candles jealous. She stood before the high septon and allowed him to speak to her, as if her soul had lost its way to heaven. She sent the Kettleblacks with small errands that mapped other people's secrets. She spoke to Pycelle about old laws, and to Qyburn about ways to make pain teach manners. She smiled at Margaery and said gracious things in a voice that had learned to copy graciousness, and then left her wine where a girl from Highgarden could taste it, and say to herself that Lannister vintage was not so fine as its reputation. She taught herself to walk more slowly so people would think she was dignified. She learned the new servants' names and forgot the old ones on purpose. In a small room, made of stone so old, it had learned to be gentle. Varys told Littlefinger's absence to a spider who had lost a leg. "He is gone," he said to the creature, "but his threads tug." How charming. He made a list in his head of men who had sat with Littlefinger and laughed too easily. He put a pin in 3 names and left the others to ripen. The wall sent a letter stamped with a crude hand. It spoke of a king with a fiery heart, fighting black shadows thrown by the sun itself. It spoke of a boy with eyes like a winter sky taking command of a fortress that had forgotten how to be afraid. It asked for barley and men and axes that would not break when a cold thing bit them. Joffrey read it twice. He felt his grandfather's breath without looking at him. "I will not send men to freeze," Tywin said simply. "Not now." "I will send grain," Joffrey said. Tywin nodded once. "You like to be merciful to men you will never meet." "I like to have a realm from which letters can travel," Joffrey said, and found himself tired of the sound of his own cold cleverness. He signed the order and felt very young and very old in the same breath. On an evening when the wind came off the bay with a taste of kettles, Joffrey walked a long terrace alone and let himself think of children he might have that he would not yet make. He thought of how a prince could be taught not to pull wings off flies by taking him to the place where men lose their hands for theft. He thought of Margaery's hair, which smelled sometimes like bread left near a window. He thought of his mother's eyes and the way they had begun to grow water in them when no water was needed. He thought of Tywin's back, which had never stooped but would one day, and what the city would do when the cliff finally slid. He thought of dragons. He was not afraid of dragons in the way a child is afraid of the dark. He was afraid of stories about dragons and what they do to men who have gotten used to the arithmetic of taxes. In the morning, a ship put in with a Braavosi hull, and a merchant with a voice that had learned to sound more honest than the truth. He brought news that had touched 3 ports on its way. Meereen had learned a queen's name. It had also learned that a queen's love for slaves is an expensive habit. It had also learned that cities defended by children must grow old overnight. The merchant told the council that yes, there were dragons, and no, they were not as large as the shadow men imagined. "But they will be," he said and smirked, "because a man who sells wine always believes he can sell fear in the same casks." "If she comes," Joffrey said, "she will find a city that has learned to make bread out of grudges." Cersei snorted. "She will find boys with names for their swords." "She will find," Tywin said, "a line of ships funded with sums we will finish adding when she is on the horizon." He lifted his cup and set it down. "In the meantime, we will tell the people a story they can repeat without choking." "Margaery," she looked up, measured the currents and smiled. "A summer fair," she said. "A week of plays and prizes for good loaves. Men will compete for the king's purse by building ovens in the square and giving away the bread they bake." "Bread is old," Cersei said, contempt lifting her lip. "Bread is always new," Margaery replied gently. "We cannot give them dragons. They would burn themselves," Tyrion said, amused. "Let them bake," Tywin said. "And let a rumor run that those who steal bread at the fair will be made to bake twice as much in the king's ovens the next day, with their and their neighbors watching. Kindness with work around it," Joffrey said, liking the sentence until he saw that he did. The fair came and went, and the city did not riot. Men sang while their dough rose. A woman from Flea Bottom beat a baker from Pomegranate Row and wept with embarrassment until Margaery kissed her cheek and called her mistress. Joffrey stood at a distance and learned he liked the smell of bread the way he liked the smell of leather, because both meant men had been set tasks and done them. He gave a purse to a boy whose loaf had been ugly and perfect, and said nothing else. The boy went home and showed his mother the coin, and she did not weep, because she had none left. When night fell, Dogs barked at the new moon, as if it were a thin bone thrown by a stingy god. Joffrey slept and woke and dreamed and did not remember his dreams. He heard 2 rooms away the sound of his mother pacing. He saw 3 days later the way the lines had deepened near her mouth. He did not know how to help her. He was not sure he wished to. He sensed in her a need to make a fire purely to prove that she could still draw men to warm their hands at it. He watched her, when she thought no one was watching, touch the hand's chain when it was hung unworn on a peg and flinch, as if it were hot. A rider from the Riverlands brought news that the Freys had quarreled with a neighbor and killed 2 boys by mistake. Walder wrote a letter that blamed arrogance and insisted on his own generosity in making amends. Tywin read it and looked very briefly, very deeply tired. "Old men," he said, "do not grow ashamed. They grow only more like themselves." "We will grow rid of them," Joffrey said, quick and flippant and too young. Tywin did not rebuke him. He folded the letter in half, and then again, and set it on the table as if it had become something other than words. A small, flat stone to weight other matters. The mountain died on a day when the city smelled of fish. Qyburn came to the council with eyes that had been looking at a candle and did not wish to adjust to faces. "He is gone," he said. "The poison burned him as if it had a god behind it." "Does it matter?" Tyrion asked mildly. "Which god?" "It matters," Qyburn said, his voice too soft for the room. "That poison can be both tool and testimony." "We will testify to nothing," Tywin said. "There will be no proclamation." Cersei's mouth went small around a savor that was not grief. "Dorne will write a poem." "Let them," Tywin said. "We will answer with pigs and cement." Joffrey imagined the huge body cooling, and some small thing in him that had admired strength without honor found itself uncertain. He pictured Oberyn's crushed head, and wished again that the story had ended in a cleaner cut. He wished for a thing that blood seldom delivered: tidiness. He kept the wish in his mouth and let it dissolve without swallowing. Sansa came to the Godswood and sat with her hands in her lap and counted breaths. Joffrey found her there by accident, or because he had wanted to. He stood at a distance that made courtesy easier. She did not rise. "Your Grace," she said. "My lady," he replied. And when she glanced up, he saw that grief had not erased her altogether. It had only thinned her, as hunger thins people in a year when the harvest is late. "I am told your gods prefer silence. They prefer to be remembered without demands," she said. She pressed her lips together as if words wanted to escape her. He waited, to his own surprise. "I heard the mountain is dead." "He is," Joffrey said. "And the prince?" she said, and the word prince carried nothing but admiration for courage. "He is dead also." "Also," Joffrey said. She looked at the face carved in the heart tree, at the old red lines that had been tears once, when someone with a knife wanted them to be. "Does anything end here? Or do things end somewhere else and we hear about them in rooms and make our faces say what they must?" "Things end where men watch them," Joffrey said. "Which is why so many men try not to look. You looked away," she said without accusation. "Simply marking the fact." "I was advised to," he said. "Do you always do what you are advised?" she asked, and then realized the insolence, and flinched. "More often than I did," he said. "Less often than my advisors wish." Sansa stood then, and made a small courtesy, because standing makes conversation endable. "Thank you for the bread," she said, and he could not tell if she meant the fare or different thing entirely. He wanted to say, "I did not bake it." He wanted to say, "You will not thank me later." He said nothing. She left the trees, and the rustle of her gown against the leaves sounded to him like a door being shut softly with a hand that could have slammed it, and chose not to. Autumn came in a series of breath changes, rather than a single day. The air at dawn held iron where it had held sugar. The harbor learned to look gray for hours at a time. Men began to speak more often of the North, because the North was about to become the kind of story old men want to tell, because it hurts them. Stannis' banners smoked in letter after letter, and men who had always hated him for his voice began to admire him for the angle at which he faced the icy wind. "Will you invite him south?" Margaery asked one evening, watching the last light die in a line that made the city look etched. "If he comes south," Joffrey said, "he will do it like a dagger, not like a guest." "That is a way of entering a room," Margaery said. She turned to him. "You cannot live in a room you have stabbed." "You can," Joffrey said, "but everyone will stand." "Teach them to sit," Margaery said very softly, and smiled in a way he had not seen before. "It is a better kind of power." He thought of Tywin, who could fill a room with silence. He thought of Cersei, who filled it with sound and then scorned the men who heard it. He thought of himself, and did not feel what he had felt at 14 when men had called his temper a king's temper, and he had preened as if flattery were oil. He felt the shape of a thing he was not ready to name. He kissed his wife and found her warmth steady. On a rain-licked night, a raven pounded at a window as if it were a criminal denied confession. The letter it carried was brittle with cold. It spoke of fires on a frozen lake and dead men who did not know it, and a man with a red beard who called himself king in a voice that made boys want to follow him, because his laughter had learned to survive. It asked for something it could not name that was not grain and not words and not men. It asked for belief. Joffrey put it next to the other letters and felt the pressure of things at the margins, which the city could ignore for only so long. He looked at Tywin and found in the old man's face a serenity that had nothing to do with comfort. The hand would never, if he could help it, allow mysteries to be duties. Joffrey wondered if he would live long enough to find that he could not make the North obey the arithmetic of his counsel. One morning he woke before the light and did not know at first why his heart beat faster than a man's who has merely rolled to a cooler patch of sheet. He lay still and listened. Somewhere, a woman laughed the way a girl laughs when a joke is bad, but the joke teller is handsome. The sound came from a courtyard and brought with it the smell of horses. He stood and went in bare feet to the window. The city was an outline. He could feel, not hear, the sea breathing beyond it. He had the strange thought then, sudden as a child's errant run, that he could rule this place, that he could make it less cruel and remain himself, that he could make it fear him only when fear would use itself well. It was a thought a priest would have gilded and ruined with adjectives. He held it like a knife and did not show it to anyone. Tywin grew older by a hair's width each day without showing it anywhere except his eyes. He met with men who smelled of wood smoke and men who smelled of wine. He set his cups down with the same care regardless. He wrote to Dorne and did not flatter. He promised and did not threaten. He sent gold somewhere to the Riverlands and received the promise of pigs. He sent a man to speak to the Iron Bank in a voice that sounded like stone falling into water. And the bank replied with a long letter that meant, "We will allow you to live because your sums are credible." He allowed Cersei to rage at him twice a week and did not allow her to change anything important. He permitted Margaery to plan fairs and decrees that made a virtue of bread and a public vice of hoarding. He allowed Joffrey to overrule him 3 times in small things and once in a thing that mattered: how to announce the Boltons' elevation to the north without making the north spit. "You will say," Tywin instructed, "that this is a stop on the road to peace." "It is not," Joffrey said, angry without quite knowing at whom. "It is a stop on the road to remembering who owns whose children." "Then do not say it," Tywin said. "Say instead that winter requires men to stand in certain places even if the ground there tastes bad." Joffrey stood before the court and said neither. He said that the North would be guarded by a man whose loyalty had been shown in the ugliest way a man can show it, and that ugly loyalty is sometimes more reliable than pretty vows. He said the name Stark once, and the sound in the hall changed without meaning to. He did not look at Sansa because he refused to be taken into her, seeing where he did not choose to go. Cersei watched him as if he were a stranger she had decided to seduce. Margaery watched him as if he were a puzzle she enjoyed. A cold, clear day came when the bay showed all its filth and none of its green, and the air tasted like iron nails. Joffrey walked alone and let the cold make a map on his face. At the end of the parapet, Tywin was waiting, as if the boy had been summoned by a bell no one else could hear. "You are doing the work," Tywin said without greeting. "I am doing a work," Joffrey said. He put his hands on the stone and felt the damp. "You have learned to let Counsel enter without being eaten by it," Tywin said. "For now." He turned his head to look at his grandson full. There was something in the old man's face that had never been there when he looked at his own children. Pride, perhaps, mixed with a relief he would never admit. Men will try to make you into the answer to their own questions. Some will want a sword. Some will want a husband for their mothers. Some will want an excuse for why they still live as they do. Disappoint them. Give them a king. What is a king, if not a man's answer? Joffrey asked. "A king," Tywin said, "is the full stop at the end of a sentence written by many hands." Joffrey looked at the water where a ship cut an even furrow and steered it like a signature. "I do not like being a mark on a page." "Learn to be the page," Tywin said. "Then every mark will belong to you." For the first time, Joffrey felt an affection that was not simple admiration crack through his dislike for instruction. He thought of the cliff that had taught him to stop shouting at waves. He thought of a man who would die one day and leave him in a room full of echoes. "I will be the page," he said, more to the heir than to his grandfather. He meant, "I will be the thing that endures." Winter came down in the letters faster than in the air. The north hardened. The Riverlands kept counting their chickens and finding only feathers. Dorne withdrew into its heat, like a snake into a rock. The bay froze around its rims like ale left too long on a windowsill. The city pulled its cloak tighter and swore at the wind. Joffrey learned to breathe smoke in the morning and like it. He learned how grain runs quicker than water if you are careless. He learned that when he walked through the fish market with Margaery laughing and a guard a step behind, a woman would hold up a child to be seen by him, even if the child was asleep. He learned how to look quickly and nod so that he became part of a memory that might nourish someone on a lean day. At night, sometimes, he went to a small room with no windows where a crossbow waited. He would take it in his hands and let its weight align his thumping heart. He would load and aim and imagine a thing he could not shoot because the room contained only straw and triumphant silence. He would put the bow down as if it were an animal he had almost whipped and leave. He suspected this was not virtue. He suspected this was training for a future in which he would be very good at hurting at the right time. He did not know if that was worse. In the Far East, a queen learned to sit on a bench like a judge and listen to petitions that sounded like songs from a country she did not speak. In the North, a boy with a face that could make men obey told wild people to stop being wild, and they did not know whether to laugh or to remember their dead and be angry instead. In Dorne, a prince with a bad leg wrote letters with the carefulness of a man forced to walk his language. In the Vale, a woman dragged a ladder up to a bed and dreamed of air, and found a man waiting under her with a hand that had learned to pat and a mouth that had learned to soothe. In the Riverlands, a wolf song still haunted men who called themselves practical and yet woke with wet faces. In the Red Keep, a boy stood on a terrace and listened to gulls and found that their idiotic hunger pleased him because it had nothing to do with him at all. He lifted his face to the wind and closed his eyes and felt, for a very brief moment that was no sooner named than fleeing, the happiness of a man who has been given a large task and is not afraid to begin it. The gulls argued with one another. The bells muttered. The bay made its greedy sounds. He opened his eyes and thought of lists to make. Ships to fund, merchants to threaten, a mother to placate without feeding her fire, a wife to respect without letting her become a curtain over the window he needed to see out of, a hand to obey and then sometimes to disobey, a realm to keep from eating itself, a north to feed without marrying it. He smiled a very small smile, and somewhere far away, something with wings turned its head, as if it had felt the movement of a line drawn in a city it had never seen. The next morning he called for quills and brought the council a plan that was not entirely his, and was, at last, not entirely anyone else either. He laid it out on the table, with the awkwardness of a young smith setting his first sword before old men. It had edges. It had balance. It would cut if guided by a firm hand and kept oiled. Tywin looked at it and did not nod. He stood, and the room stood with him. "We have a day," he said, "of bread and letters." He rested a hand near, not on, the paper as Joffrey had once rested a hand near, not on, the knife, and the boy watched the old man's fingers for a sign that did not come. Instead, there was merely work and breath, and the knowledge that sometimes listening is the bravest act a king can shape into a habit, and the certainty that one day, when the brave habit no longer served, he would have to decide whether to be the song or the silence, and that the city, insolent and beautiful, would make a story out of whichever decision he made.